So this is story of a 10-year-old girl who was referred to me on 5th of August with a history of fever which really began on 18th of July. So when she came to me, she had a fever of almost 18 days duration. And this began as a low-grade fever, which was intermittent, and she was afebrile in between. And before she presented to me for the preceding 3 days, the fever was continuous and it was peaking up to 104. There was a history of loss of appetite and she has lost almost 1 kilo. Uh, she was hospitalized with us 7 days later, and the duration of fever was almost running into fourth week now. She was well in interfebrile period. Her fever responded to medicines. She had markedly reduction in her oral intake and she started vomiting, which was non-bilious, non-bloody, not associated with any headache, pain abdomen or distension. There were no urinary symptoms. Stools were normal. There was no skin rash or bleeds, and there was no joint swelling or any other swelling, and there was no history of contact with tuberculosis. So this is the history. Anybody wants to ask questions or?
Sir, when did the fever become 104 after how many days?
Almost say on 2nd of August. She started her illness in the on say 17th or 18th of July, and she came to me on 5th of August. So almost we can say 3 weeks into the illness.
For the first 3 weeks, only low grade fever.
Low grade intermittent fever. She used to become afebrile, and she was well in interfebrile period.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Sujata, you have any questions at this point?
So I think basically this patient has prolonged fever without any localizing signs except for vomiting, which could be somewhat non-specific. Other than that, no localizing signs.
Okay. This child was hospitalized prior to our hospitalization uh, in some other hospital, and where she received two blood transfusions on 18th, 28th, and 29th of July. And there were a lot of investigations which were done, and I would tabulate the relevant investigations with our investigations. But her cultures were sterile, uh, liver function test, kidney function test were normal, and 3 serial CBCs were done, which I'll show you little later. Now, when she came to us in the hospital, uh, she had a weight and height which were very almost 50th percentile for her age. So she has been growing rather well prior to her illness. She was conscious, alert, oriented. There were no meningeal signs. On presentation, she did not have fever, but she had tachycardia. The pulses were hyperdynamic because she has very marked significant anemia. Her blood pressure was normal. There was no edema, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, bleeds, lymphadenopathy, and systemic examination was essentially normal. So this was at presentation. Any further questions or?
Any oral ulcers?
No oral ulcers.
So that's exactly an excellent point, Girish. I was just going to make that point and ask that these patients, when they present you with such dramatic anemia and fever, we want to look at the hard palate. So you simply cannot shine a torch into the child's mouth and see what is going on. You specifically have to direct the light to the hard palate and look for hard palatal, non-painful mucositis, which can be a very subtle but very, very helpful for the clinical diagnosis of these children.
This child did not have any oral ulcers.
Right, thank you.
At this time when she had significant anemia and which had required two blood transfusions, we thought we will take a hematological opinion. And the hematologist who is an adult hematologist here, he thought very strongly of HLH, though I personally did not agree with him that point of time. And he suggested a workup for HLH, start the child on pulse methylprednisolone, give broad spectrum antibiotics, and folic acid and B12 supplements.
क्या बोले? अरे बोलो बुक रखने बोले मैं बोला।
So during her course in the hospital, she required frequent transfusions with us also. And when we had first asked the blood bank, they had reported difficulty in cross matching of the blood, which was a very important clue to what is going on with this child. Now, this is very important slide. I would like all of you to pay attention. This shows periodically 18th July is somewhere where she really started her illness. This is the time when she received her blood transfusion. This is the time when I saw her first time in the my OPD. And this is the time when she was admitted with her, this 13th and 14th of August. And 14th of August was the time when she acutely deteriorated in the hospital. So she had very significant anemia all through. And at the time when she deteriorated, her hemoglobin had dropped to 2 grams per cent. The MCV in one report, which is just prior to transfusion, was macrocytic. And at the time when she deteriorated, she had the highest MCV here. And if you look at serially, the most outstanding feature was that the RBC count was going downhill. I mean, at the time when she had the severe most anemia, she had lowest RBC count of 0.33 million. And for the first time when she had the most severe anemia, her MCH and MCHC were sky high. Prior to that, she had been investigated for sickle cell, MP, Vidal negative, CRP 0.86, hemoglobin electrophoresis was done, which was normal, HIV was negative, and this is the time when she received blood transfusion in the other hospital. Here, by the time she came to us, this is the most important point, that she had DCT positive, and her peripheral smear for the first time showed agglutination, which was very strongly positive. There were no abnormal cells, and even at this point, the retic was only 2.8%. So this is the clinical picture and the hematological picture which evolved over a period of time. So here there are 2 points which we would like to discuss. One is the low RBC count, and second, now it's becoming very obvious that she has autoimmune hemolytic anemia here, which is very clear here.
Did you ever check for urine hemoglobin, sir?
There was urine color was almost always normal. We had repeated urine examination.
The color was normal, but urine hemoglobin was tested?
No, urine hemoglobin was not checked.
Because
I
one,
think, yeah, sorry, go on, Girish.
there's one contradictory picture here. PS showing agglutination is usually seen in cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
Right.
Usually cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia is intravascular hemolysis, where you'll get hemoglobin 88.
Right.
Also in cold agglutinin anemia, we'll have high MCHC, which is there on 14th/8.
I mean, I was initially misled by the low RBC count of this child when I first saw her in the OPD. And that time we had the MCV, which was, we were constantly focusing on this, and we were focusing on MCH and MCHC. So I had, my mind was working in a direction of some kind of a bone marrow involvement in this child, though only one series was mostly involved.
Low RBC count only suggests that the child has severe anemia, nothing more than that.
Yeah, but Girish, in the
Girish,
view of,
could it be agglutination?
Sorry?
So if your RBCs are agglutinated, you may have 100,000 RBCs counted as 100. So I think a very important point is, and Girish, I of looking at your CBC lecture, which I thought was outstanding. I felt like an undergraduate third year student again. It was excellent. Is that the machine is not smarter than the man. And when you have such disparate results on the pool to counter, you must have a hematologist looking at the slides, because what you can get with a human review is remarkable. For instance, you never take a thrombocytopenia pool to counter as being appropriate. You always want a manual count done, right? So that's very important. And Dr. Savar, to your point about the red blood cell series being low and one suspecting a malignancy, I think a little unusual in children. You may expect it as a bystander effect in an adult patient with, for example, a lymphoma. But in children presenting with such remarkable anemia without any other cell line depletion, I mean, I'm not a hematologist, but I think it's unusual for kids then to have a malignancy presenting with profound anemia.
Yeah, you are absolutely right, Dr. Sujata. And last time, I mean, few days ago, when I discussed this case with you, and I tried to fish out the explanation as to why RBC count could be low in a child who has autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So I came across a series of around 256 kids with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, which was described from France. And they found that around 40% of those kids can have initially low RBC count and reticulocytopenia, which could be a transient phenomena, which can last anywhere between 6 to 70 days. And they said that the autoimmune process can involve the RBC precursors as well in the marrow. So that is probably one explanation. And second, as you said, the RBC, if they are agglutinated, would the number go down so drastically low? But I would expect that at a time when her RBC count was low, if it was because of agglutination, this child should have had the MCV, which should have been way away above, because the same principle would apply in the counter, that the large RBC will be counted as or picked up as macrocyte. So that was not matching.
Also, I don't know the answer here, but would the RBC count elevation be proportional to the rate of drop of hemoglobin because of massive hemolysis? So when you have a massive hemolysis, your bone marrow may not just respond with a snap of a finger. It will take some days to pick up. If you have a slow hemolytic process ongoing, the bone marrow will be able to ramp up and produce adequate amount. But if the bone marrow is taken aback by a sudden flood of antibodies, and mind you, what happens is that in children who have got an autoimmune hemolytic anemia, who have been given blood transfusions, you increase the generation of antibodies and the requirement of blood transfusion increases. So the rule of thumb in children with AIHA is to avoid the repeated blood transfusion unless you have a hemodynamic compromise like a HB of 2 or 3 that you will not be able to sleep with even if the child will, or the child is requiring oxygen. So we try and hold back. We try and hold our hands together and not give a transfusion because that increases autoantibody generation.
So you are absolutely right. I mean, these are the two explanations which I picked up from that series of 250 children, that the bone marrow may be suppressed by the autoimmune process and the RBC progenitors may be affected, and the bone marrow may not respond like a snap of finger, as you very rightly said. So these were two explanations apart from the RBC's count may be low because of the clumps of the RBC as counted low. So normally speaking, when you have agglutination in the peripheral smear, your MCV is very remarkably high in these children. And it has been said that this is unexplainable high MCV in a patient which crosses 200, 250. Along with that, you have marked spherocytosis and the MCHC goes high. So this combination of macrocytosis and MCHC high is almost a diagnostic of a autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
Also, Dr. Savar, in patients who have autoimmune conditions, you can have a mixed picture where you can have the production of warm and cold antibodies.
Right.
So you may have a lot of warm antibodies, but some cold as well, especially in children and adults with lupus. Vis-a-vis infectious etiologies like mycoplasma or EBV, where you say, you'll have cold antibodies. In these children, you can sometimes have a mixed picture. And that can confabulate your finding.
I mean, Girish raised a very good point about hemoglobinuria. It may, I mean, we were looking for a gross hemoglobinuria. We didn't check for a biochemical test in the lab. But though the warm antigens are warm antibodies are generally associated with extravascular hemolysis, but they can also have a degree of intravascular hemolysis if the antibody load is too high. So this is described
Yes.
that a warm antibody can, depending on the antibody load, have intravascular hemolysis.
Yes, I mean, these rules about the cold antibody being an intravascular hemolysis and the warm antibody generating a reticuloendothelial endothelial system hemolysis are really predominantly this or that, but not absolute.
Yeah, you are right. So
So sorry, the other thing, Dr. Savar, that would have been quite helpful in this patient is to see what the ESR was in this child. So we have a
unfortunately, ESR
protein
was
that
not
was
done, but that is the
0.98.
point I was trying to make, that the CRP was low, but the
Yes.
ESR was not done.
So if the ESR was available, that would have been very helpful.
Yeah, sure. This is especially I picked up this image to show to Girish that we benefited from his lecture, and I looked at these peaks, two peaks in the RBC histogram, which he had very nicely shown that if you have such a peak coming up, you must think of a large RBC, which are abnormally large, and must think of autoimmune hemolytic process. Uh, so by then the diagnosis was made, but this was to re-emphasize what Girish has told us in his excellent lecture. Do you agree, Girish? Can't see if he's.
Do we have Girish there? He's there, but he's muted. I don't know.
So as he had suggested that we must always look at the histogram.
Did the hematologist advise?
Beg your pardon?
Did the hematologist advise steroid without doing a marrow?
Before doing?
Before doing the bone marrow?
Yeah.
Yeah, bone marrow he had not considered at all.
Without doing the marrow?
Yeah, we did not do marrow on this child.
It's very seldom that you do a marrow on a patient who has a low hemoglobin without any other cell line depletion. So you did get the platelet going down later on, yes.
Girish, would you consider a diagnosis of, say, Evans syndrome based on this particular CBC report where the platelet is also going down now?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Evans syndrome, autoimmune hemolytic anemia plus autoimmune thrombocytopenia is a definite possibility.
And there's another very important clue here, Dr. Savar.
Yeah.
When you look at the red cell count here, can you see this patient has a frank lymphopenia? So
Yeah.
if you have to say this patient has a viral infection, you expect a lymphocytosis. So here you have three things. You have a agglutination and a hemolytic anemia. You have a thrombocytopenia with the lymphopenia. And these three things together are giving you the diagnosis right here without any, particular ANA, etc. workup being done.
Right. Would you comment on this histogram, Girish, or is it sufficient what I
Yeah,
interpret?
perfect. What you said is correct.
Okay.
Absolutely correct.
These were the other.
Sorry, Dr. Savar, just can you go back, please? Could you say it on the platelet histogram? Is it very wide? Is this histogram very wide or is it okay? If you're seeing a thrombocytopenia there, would you describe this as a large distribution of
Yeah,
size of
it
platelet?
is. Yeah, but the MPV is
Isn't
only
it?
10.
Okay.
Do you have anything specific in mind by this wide distribution of platelet?
I'm just thinking like you have a lot of immature platelets which are coming up. You have a lot of immature RBCs which come up when you have a hemolytic anemia. When you have an autoimmune thrombocytopenia, you have platelet of different ages which are
Yeah.
being thrown out of the bone marrow to compensate. And probably this is showing that.
Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Sujata. Can I ask?
Sure.
Am I clear, loud and clear?
Very clear.
So, from that CBC report, you rightly said that this patient has lymphopenia, does not have neutropenia. In all such patients, I have always had a doubt. If it was bone marrow malignancy like leukemia, you have neutropenia, not lymphopenia as we saw in this patient. So absence of neutropenia would make you not do a marrow, or all such patients would still go ahead with a marrow to rule out malignancy.
So there are no absolutes, Girish, in clinical medicine. I would look at several things, including the age of the patient. So when you're under 5, you normally have a lymphocyte which is more than a neutrophil. So I wouldn't be so alarmed if I have lymphocytosis in that child. But if I have an older patient, say 8, 9, 10, who has a lymphocyte of 70% and thereby a neutropenia with a total count of say 3,000, I would be alarmed and marrow there. Right? So it's not that much the neutropenia as it is the absolute lymphocyte count and what's happening that. And if at an older age you have a lymphocyte predominant disease in a child who's unwell, your antenna have to be up. It's very unlikely to be autoimmune in nature. It could be viral, but it as well could be mitotic, but it's very unlikely to be autoimmune in nature.
Could this leukocytosis be just secondary to anemia and hemolysis?
Yes, it could be. But then you look at the proportion of lymphocytes, right? You look at the proportion of lymphocytes which are much lower than what you would expect. So, you know, you expect this kind of a picture if this patient has been given 3 pulses of IV steroid. That will give you margination of the white cells and a very big peak of the mature neutrophils in the periphery. So this is something we see very often, that as you give a patient steroids, you know, the count will go up to 25, 30,000. And then everybody gets alarmed because yesterday it was 10,000. It means nothing. It just means that the liver and spleen have been squeezed and the neutrophils have come into the periphery, into what you can count. The total body amount is the same, but what is countable has dramatically gone up because you've given steroids.
And from the marginal pool of the vessels, the neutrophils are coming into the circulation.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. So these were other investigations. When I saw rest of the investigations were done, so I asked for a chest X-ray to see any mediastinal widening or anything which would suggest a hematological malignancy in this child. A CT chest was done. And these 3 investigations were done on the insistence of the hematologist's first opinion. He was suggesting HLH. So the ferritin was high, but rest of the 2 parameters were within normal limits. So I find it difficult in practice to base the diagnosis of HLH on only on ferritin, because though the criteria says ferritin more than 500, but in practice the ferritin levels are in thousands when you have a patient of HLH. Is that true, Girish?
You are the right person. You are right, but Dr. Sujata will give more insights into this.
No, Girish, please, please carry on. So basically, I would say to you, Dr. Samar, that when you look at the serum, so what is HLH? HLH is hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, which can be primary or secondary. Conventionally, the secondary hemophagocytosis in autoimmune disorders is given the connotation of the term macrophage activation syndrome, right? So the diagnosis of macrophage activation is in the presence of prolonged fever along with cytopenias of at least 2 cell lines, where most often the first cell line that goes down is the platelet count. Like we discussed on the phone the other day, platelets have a short half-life, and when you have hemophagocytosis, what does that mean? That means the macrophages are ingesting, engulfing, and eating away the blood cell lines. And when they are doing that, what will go down first? The platelet count will go down first, which has the shortest half-life, right? And therefore, patients who have isolated red cell line going down without a platelet or white cell going down are extremely unlikely to have HLH. And on an isolated ferritin, it is impossible to diagnose patients with HLH. It's the whole composite picture. And also, what we need to note is that the diagnostic criteria which have been put forward in diagnosed patients of systemic arthritis, not for a febrile walking, talking patient. You can't just apply the criteria and say my patient has HLH. So it has to be in the correct clinical context.
Okay. And some of the investigations which were done suggested that a process of hemolysis is going on, like the LDH going up, indirect bilirubin up, other liver functions were normal. So then one test was done which claimed the diagnosis.
So was that the anti-nuclear antibody or the direct Coombs?
Direct Coombs was positive already.
Okay, so the ANA was done.
Yeah. So this child's ANA was positive. The N dilution was 1 in 320 speckled appearance, and along with that, the C3, C4 both were less than normal. So on discussion with you, you had suggested an ENA. So we did this ENA, and this is the profile I would like you to kindly take up from here.
Okay, so Dr. Zawar, I have a couple of slides prepared. Shall I show those on the ANA and ENA?
Sure. You can share. I have
Would
allowed.
you give me
Should I
allowed
stop sharing?
Okay. Yes, please. Only then can I share. So can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just, may I take a couple of minutes, Dr. Zawar?
Please.
Okay, so what I'd like to discuss really very briefly is the ANA and ENA that we talk about. So first of all, let's just go back to our physiology.
Your voice is lost. I think she will be rejoining. She has lost connection. Anybody would like to make any comments till she rejoins? Dr. Rajesh or Dr. Girish in the meanwhile, if they want to make any point. Or for that matter, anybody else who wishes to make any point, comment.
As I mentioned on the chat, as you were narrating, I was thinking of HLH initially.
Right.
The second thing is that about the hemoglobin, I thought the speed of fall of hemoglobin was a bit too fast.
Right.
So even before you put up the investigation, I mean, that speed could have alerted us that there is a process of hemolysis going on either in addition or in isolation, meaning that bone marrow thing was the first thing and then that speed of fall.
Right.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm sorry, my internet connection just kind of vanished. Sorry. Can you hear me now, Dr. Sagar?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So sorry about that.
It's
So
okay.
basically, when we talk about ANA and ENA, it's a misnomer because the anti-nuclear antibodies are detecting antibodies against nuclear, cytoplasmic, and membrane components, and the ENAs again are not all extractable. So the anti-nuclear antibodies, they target macromolecule components in the cell nucleus, and they can bind, these antibodies can bind to DNA, RNA, proteins, as well as complexes of nucleic acid with proteins. There are some antigenic targets that are directed against only cytoplasmic components, for example, antibody to Jo1. All right. So please remember that in the nucleus, you centrally have the nucleolus. The nucleolus generates ribosomes. These are all chromatin threads in the nucleus that come together and form chromosomes when they are going to divide, when the cells are going to divide. And within of the nucleus, you also have the generation of the mRNA that is formed and goes out of the nucleus in order to go and produce proteins in the cell. So the nucleus has multiple components. And what you have to realize is that from a clinical standpoint, when you're using an antibody test, you are doing it for many reasons. So you have to look at the antibody test very, very carefully. For example, when you're doing it in primary practice, and you want to blindly pick up patients, refer on to specialist centers, then that is going to do the test when there's a very low probability. So that is for case finding. When you have a patient like whom Dr. Samar has, you want to confirm the diagnosis with an intention to treat. And in these children or adults, there's a very high pretest probability, and getting a positive ANA in this patient is going to guide you for diagnosis and for correct timely treatment to save the life of this child. And then you may have a situation where you have families where there are multiple people who have, say, familial lupus, and you want to do an ANA in some of the family members who have no clinical features, because today you are at the cutting edge of science and you want to prevent autoimmune disease. So you have to see what context are you using the anti-nuclear antibody for. The gold standard for using the ANA is the indirect immunofluorescence method. This is extremely important. It is the indirect immunofluorescence method where the cell line that has got the nucleus that you are testing for antibodies against is something that is called the HEP2 cell line. The HEP2 cell line is the cells which are taken from humans who have laryngeal carcinoma, because the nucleus is very large in those cells. And today we know that sometimes there may be a particular antigen, for example, anti-Rho, that is not well seen in those cell lines, and therefore you can transfix the HEP2 cell line with Rho artificially, and that cell line is then called HEP2000 cell line. So please note that the method is still a visual detection of the ANA, which should be done, and that report should give you an endpoint dilution titer and a pattern that is given here for you. So what do? You take the plate which has got the cells transfixed with the nucleus with several antigens which are very well expressed in those nuclei. You dilute the patient's serum. If the patient's serum has got anti-nuclear antibody, it is going to stick here to the nuclear antigen components. Then you're going to thoroughly wash it so that all the kachra is taken away, and you're going to have the ANA which is now bound to these cell lines. Then you're going to use a fluorescent anti-ANA antibody, and you're again going to repeatedly wash it, and then that is giving the fluorescence to the presence of the ANA in the patient's sera, and then you're going to have a look at it under the microscope. And when you have a look at it under the microscope, because the anti-nuclear antibody can be generated against so many components, you have different patterns. And note that the presence of the nuclear antigens in human beings is fairly constant. The site of presence of these antigens is fairly constant. So broadly speaking, two types of anti-nuclear antibodies are formed. One is the antibody that is being formed to DNA and its components. And what are the components? For example, anti-double-stranded DNA, anti-histone. What is histone? Histone is a protein that is giving a conformation to the genetic material, to the chromatid fibers within of the nucleus. It's helping it to fold on itself. And what is nucleosome? Nucleosome is some amount of chromatid along with histone is called a nucleosome. So the antibodies can be against DNA and its components. The antibodies can be directed against RNA and several RNA binding proteins. And these are then anti-SM, anti-RNP, anti-Rho. And then you can have some other antigens against which the antibody is directed, which don't really fit any specific constitution. And when you look at these anti-nuclear antibodies under the indirect immunofluorescence, you see these various patterns. Now you can see that these patterns are different, but may not be to your and my eye. They are different to a very trained eye. Okay, so that you can have homogeneous pattern where you have the antibody directed against histones. You can have a rim pattern against double-stranded DNA, a centromere pattern when it is anti-centromere, a speckled pattern when it is against RNA and RNA proteins, and a nucleolar pattern when it is antibodies to specific RNA, as is seen in patients with systemic sclerosis. So the definition of these patterns is done visually by the trained human eye, and there are some overlaps and difficulties when you are looking at these patterns. Okay, so that is very important to know. And what you need to know is something very, very simple, and don't go into technical details about this. Just know that there are some extractable nuclear antigens which are disease specific. So if a patient has antibody to double-stranded DNA, that patient's got lupus. If it's against U1-RNP, that patient's got mixed connective tissue disease. If it's anti-centromere, it's limited systemic sclerosis. If it's anti-Jo1, it's a myositis. When it's against anti-topoisomerase 1, then it is likely to be diffuse systemic sclerosis. So these are extractable nuclear antibodies which are present in specific diseases. There are some of them which are non-specific, like anti-Rho and anti-La. And if you look at the ANA in normal population, up to 20% can have it positive, and that pattern is called DFS. Again, don't worry about it. This requires a trained eye to look at it. In certain diseases such as lupus, the presence of certain specific antibodies will suggest the correlation of that antibody with clinical phenotype. So if you have a lot of anti-DS DNA, it is correlated with renal disease. If you have ribosomal P, it's correlated with neuropsychiatric disease. Specifically, if you have a lupus patient who's a young adult who's got anti-Rho, that's correlated with the development of neonatal lupus syndrome, and so on and so forth. So, that in today's day and age, if we are suspecting a systemic rheumatic disease, earlier we would do only ANAs, but today we would like to do ANA and ENA. That is very important. And without going into a lot of specific detail about it, there are now international EULAR guidelines that tell you as to what you need to do and how you need to do it. So there are 25 recommendations which have been published in 2018. There are 15 of them that talk about ANA. There are another 5 that talk about double-stranded DNA, and several more that talk about extractable nuclear antigens. So don't worry your head about this, but just know that today we want to do more than ANA when we strongly suspect a systemic anti-rheumatic, when we suspect a systemic rheumatological disorder. And there are now 30 patterns described when you look at the anti-nuclear antibody visually. Again, don't bother yourself about them except to know that earlier we were talking only of specific nuclear patterns, but today we talk of cytoplasmic patterns and some other rarer nuclear and cytoplasmic patterns. Many of the antigens against these specific patterns have not yet been identified, and this remains to be work in progress. So with those few words, I'll stop. Over to you, Dr. Sagar.
Okay.
I'm happy to take any questions or we can proceed.
Yeah, so this was very obvious from the investigations that this child presented with autoimmune hemolytic anemia as a manifestation of lupus. So customarily, the AIHA is described into cold and warm or a mixed type of hemolytic anemia. And 90% of autoimmune hemolytic anemia in children are warm antibodies. Only 10% are cold agglutinins. And cold agglutinins are more specifically related to either the infections, of which the two noteworthy are Epstein virus infection and mycoplasma. And PNH is another condition which is associated with cold agglutinins. Most warm antibodies are associated with either a primary or secondary. If you look at the distribution of primary and secondary diseases in children, they are almost equally divided between primary and secondary causes. And when a child presents to us with autoimmune hemolytic anemia without any concerning findings, that means you don't have a clinical clue to the secondary cause of AIHA. It is recommended that you do at least 3 or 4 tests in those children. One is definitely ANA. And second is that you should do an immunological profile of all children who present to you with primary AIHA. And the third is, if you have a clinical situation of cold agglutinins, then you should look for serological evidence of either EBV or mycoplasma. So this child had a primary, this child had an AIHA, which was secondary AIHA, secondary to SLE.
So Dr. Sagar, may I add here that I think a lot also depends upon the age of presentation of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So when you have a young infant presenting with profound AIHA, those patients often have an immune dysregulation. Very often they may have a B cell immunodeficiency and be presenting with AIHA, or they may have very serious forms of immunodeficiency. I think it's the older girls specifically who are more likely to have the secondary forms of AIHA.
I mean, occasionally, very rarely, lupus can have cold agglutinins, and I was looking for references. They are very odd, stray case reports.
Yes.
One is from Jamshedpur Tata Hospital, where they have described a 9-year-old girl who had AIHA secondary to lupus, which was cold agglutinin, which is extreme rare thing to happen. So most often children will have warm antibodies, primary and secondary equally divided. In the secondary group, they could have rheumatological conditions or they could have hematological malignancies. This is the total divide of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Would you like to take up the treatment part, Dr. Sujata?
Yeah, certainly. So when we have children who present to us, so one pointer is that we all learn about the skin manifestations of lupus. A child who presents to you with a malar rash, with photosensitivity, with oral mucositis, with patchy alopecia, those children, when they present with cytopenias, the diagnosis is fairly obvious and straightforward. But please note that about 30 to 40% of children with lupus will present with fever, fatigue, and cytopenias without any skin manifestation. And that's where the diagnosis for these patients becomes very challenging. The straightforward treatment of autoimmune hemolytic anemia is intravenous pulsed steroid. Depending upon the degree of anemia, you can give the child a high dose pulse of steroids, which can be 10 to 30 milligram per kg per day for 3 to 5 doses. And most children are going to respond very nicely to that. Once you do that, look at the other disease manifestations at all and see how the child is responding. A pretty standard management of these patients is to place the child on a combination then of hydroxychloroquine, and also a good drug to choose for these patients is mycophenolate mofetil. If a child has a profound hemolytic anemia, it is important that we know that these children don't very often develop significant renal disease. That combination doesn't go together. But in order to keep the hemolysis at bay, mycophenolate mofetil, hydroxychloroquine, a good dose of vitamin D, and using folic acid and B12 supplement through the acute phase of the hemolysis is a pretty standard treatment for these children.
This is just to recap what we were discussing, the difference between warm and cold agglutinin disease and their primary and secondary causes. So just to repeat that, mostly you will have equal divide between primary and secondary patients. When you have a patient with no concerning secondary manifestations of AIHA, it is recommended that you will do ANA, immunoglobulin profile, and if there is a concern about cold agglutinin, you would look for the infection serology. This is the general recommendation. If there are concerning causes, you will go according to the clinical presentation phenotype of the child to direct your investigation to elucidate a cause. So,
Savar sir, can I ask a question?
yeah.
Where does anti-eye cell disease come in this classification?
NTI is cold agglutinin.
Which is divided into two categories, right? Anti-eye
Yeah.
and the other cold agglutinin disease.
Yeah, warm
I
reactive
think that was
antibodies are
formerly called as paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. Formerly, I remember there was a separate item, paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, and third was cold agglutinin disease. Probably they have combined both now.
Yeah, the antigen which are described is with warm reactive antibodies. It is generally Rh system. With the cold agglutinin disease is either a capital or a small I. And for PCH, it is Dorothy Landsteiner antigen. So these are the antigen to which the antibodies are generally directed.
Right. Paroxysmal cold. Okay.
I think a very important thing you mentioned in that table there is the role of the immunoglobulins, looking at the B cell arm in younger infants who present with autoimmune hemolytic anemia.
Yeah, both primary and secondary immune deficiency can present as AIJ. And if you have a combination of autoimmune thrombocytopenia and autoimmune hemolytic anemia, then it forms Evans syndrome. And two most important diagnoses are combined variable immune deficiency and Wiskott-Eldridge syndrome. So those two diseases are to be excluded in a child who has Evans syndrome.
So when I trained in the UK, Dr. Savar, in Great Ormond Street, as a rule of thumb, you will not label a patient to have a systemic rheumatic disorder unless you've done the immunoglobulins. And I would wonder to myself why. And then once in a year, you'd pick up a Wiskott-Aldrich or you'd pick up a patient with CVID, and it's a totally different paradigm of how to manage those patients. So sometimes protocols become so important, and this is something we can miss if you are not doing the immunoglobulin profile.
Yeah. And this is the last follow-up. This child on a treatment has done extremely well. Her RBC, hemoglobin, everything has come back to normal. Platelet counts are stabilized. Her urine routine examination is normal. Protein creatinine ratio is normal. Her direct Coombs test is still positive, and her complements have returned back to normal. So
another thing to note here is that we always do the anti-phospholipid antibodies in these patients. We know that even in patients who have primary anti-phospholipid antibody, they can also have autoimmune hemolytic anemia as a presentation without having significant thrombocytopenia. And in addition to the antibodies that are directed against the red cell membrane, if you have anti-phospholipid antibodies, these can also cross-react against the RBC phospholipid, and these patients can continue to have AIHA. So then in these children, what we would do is that once the platelet count is above 100,000, we will add low dose aspirin for these children.
You were mentioning about the importance of looking at PS, and you had mentioned about looking for TTP in these children also.
Absolutely. So I think that when a patient with lupus presents to us with anemia, the differential diagnosis can be very wide. It can go from a patient who's got anemia of chronic disease to autoimmune hemolytic anemia to microangiopathic hemolytic anemia without fulfilling all the criteria for TTP, and to the child having mass, to the child having a drug toxicity. So the differentials for anemia and lupus are wide open, and the peripheral smear exam is extremely important, because for the child who has MAHA, bathing that patient in steroids is not going to help the child. And I told you about 12 years ago, I learned my lesson with this patient who had frank lupus. She was febrile, she had direct Coombs positive disease, she had thrombocytopenia, polyarthritis, proteinuria. So we started pulsing her with steroid. And 3 days later, this patient's HB that was 8 was down to 4 or 5. And I was so alarmed and looked at all the reports once again and then realized, that, oh my God, this patient has schistocytes on the peripheral smear. And then we had a very big debate in our unit. How do we treat this patient who's sitting, alert, talking, walking, has no renal impairment at all, but she has got very low hemoglobin? And this patient had a combination of MAHA and Coombs positive hemolytic anemia. We gave her 2 gram IVIG and she was perfectly okay within 72 hours. So note that IVIG can be used as a surrogate for plasmapheresis in the child who is not desperately sick. So evaluation of a very common complaint like anemia can be very challenging if you are, gung-ho about, done that, seen that. So every patient requires a very, very careful evaluation. We also had another patient, Dr. Samar, with lupus who presented to us with pancytopenia. And this patient had Coombs positive hemolytic anemia, pancytopenia, normal ferritin, and did not do very well with IV steroids, had a negative schistocyte. There were no helmet cells or sign of any fragmentation of MAHA on the smear. And the child did not pick up with steroids or IVIG. We did a bone marrow on this patient, and she was an unusual child who had hypoplasia of the bone marrow. And then we started digging into the literature. We gave this child rituximab, and within 2 weeks, she bounced back with normal counts. So every patient requires very careful evaluation as to how you assess and then how you match the medication to the problem that the child has got.
So in retrospect,
Was
I
this a
think when
case
the
of
child, yeah, please go ahead, Girish.
Was this a case of SLE-induced myelofibrosis then?
No.
Secondary
No, myelofibrosis is an
myelofibrosis.
irreversible. Myelofibrosis is irreversible. This was about 12, 13 years ago. This patient had a hypoplastic marrow and we gave her rituximab. She's perfectly okay, normal counts. You wouldn't expect that in myelofibrosis. Though occasionally you can get it in patients with lupus as well. So the question that arises is that which patient would you use upfront rituximab in when faced with autoimmune hemolytic anemia? To my mind, because the neurological complications that occasionally happen with rituximab, we don't use it upfront. However, currently we have an 18-month-old child who is ANA positive, who has got normal immunoglobulins, and who has got profound bicytopenia, who is strongly ANA positive, dsDNA positive with low complements, who has not responded to IVIG, to multiple doses of steroids, is transfusion dependent, is on a combination of mycophenolate, tacrolimus. So that patient, yesterday we have started now on rituximab, and we are looking for monogenic causes of lupus and trying to identify if this patient has some weird and wonderful congenital immunodeficiency syndrome. Because at 18 months to present with an HB of 2 and platelet of 6,000 is big trouble, big trouble.
So, Dr. Sujata, in retrospect, I think when this child first presented to a primary pediatric colleague, and when the child had fever of some duration, and one significant finding was anemia, then probably the workup of anemia should have been much more focused, and a peripheral smear examination and to look for evidence of hemolysis were paramount in this child.
Absolutely. So I think that when we have children who present with abrupt, profound anemia with high-grade fever, then unless, like we were talking, the patient does not have any localizing sign of a respiratory infection, so upper or lower for EBV or for mycoplasma, we must think lupus, because the commonest presentation of lupus is fever and cytopenia in childhood. And 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 children have no skin manifestations of lupus, and you really have to hunt for the diagnosis for these patients.
So this is a very educative and very illustrative case that there is no real pressure to transfuse a child in haste, and one could wait for a complete investigation to come up with a kind of plausible diagnosis. Any other comments or final comments? Anybody would like to say anything?
We are moving more and more to using mycophenolate as a drug of choice for patients with lupus. It's just intuitive. One thinks to oneself whether one could avoid this child from developing lupus nephritis. So earlier on, we were very liberal with using methotrexate for superficial articular cutaneous manifestations. Of course, in a hemolytic anemia situation, we'd either use mycophenolate or azathioprine. Today, we know that the safety profile of mycophenolate is more than of azathioprine. So we would want to use mycophenolate for the child with a hematological problem. But even if the child didn't have a hematological problem, I'm very curious to see what other people do when they treat pediatric lupus. We've moved to using more and more mycophenolate, and we're going to vertically follow up these patients and see, can we prevent lupus nephritis? It's an open-ended question. I don't know the right answer there.
How long this child should be on HCQ and the drugs which she is currently on? What should be the follow-up?
So one size does not fit all. As far as hydroxychloroquine is concerned, it is open-ended, currently lifetime. We have been now following children in my unit for more than 20 years. And what we do is, if the patient has been inactive for over a decade, we then begin to drop the dose of hydroxychloroquine and miss out and start giving 5 days a week or alternate days. So that takes care of hydroxychloroquine. It's open-ended. As far as mycophenolate is concerned, in patients who have lupus nephritis, there the recommendations are pretty clear. You want to give it for 5 years. But in the other condition, it really depends upon how quickly the patient became better. And in any case, once the patient becomes better, you want to maintain these patients for 6 months to 1 year on the same dose, and then gradually taper every 3 to 4 months, looking to see what is the minimum dose of medication the patient needs in order to maintain a status of clinical remission. So these patients are looked at very, very carefully, like you would want to manage a child with a malignancy. In the same way, we have a lot of scoring systems that we use for these children. And in our unit, we use something that is called the SLEDAI, Systemic Lupus Erythematosus Disease Activity Index. And we look at the organ involvement that the child has got, and we aim to keep the score 0. So today, everything has become a weighted score. So even today, we have the new classification criteria of lupus, which is a European and American classification, which has come about in 2019, where the entry criteria is 1 in 80, and then you have weighted score depending upon the organ involvement. In the same way, we look at what we call the SLEDAI. It is a weighted score looking at organ involvement and also looking at the serology. So we aim to keep the child's SLEDAI 0, and we follow up the child reducing the mycophenolate. But if we find the SLEDAI is beginning to climb again, we will go back on the higher dose of mycophenolate on which the child was stable. So currently, we cannot say that these diseases are curable. You are targeting the end process of an autoimmune cascade, which has already resulted in clinical disease. So if you want to, then you have to cure the disease, and that is not yet available.
Thank you, Dr. Sujata, sir. If there are no more comments or no, this is time to profusely thank Dr. Sujata for her wonderful presence. Her guiding the discussion is always so remarkable, and we all benefit from her lot of clinical experience and very wise words. Thank you everyone for being here. Hope you have enjoyed the clinical presentation. Thank you so much.
Dr. Savar, thank you so much. It was my privilege to come to this wonderful session and learn. So thanks so much.
Thank
Good
you.
evening. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.